I felt like the bad news and the losses and all the challenges faced by people close to me or far from me kept pushing me into a state of mind of drowning in the moment and seeing no way out and feeling like the walls are closing on me. Engaging with Torah reminded me that we're part of a bigger journey and a bigger story, one that started in Mount Sinai, or even before that with Lech Lecha, with God's Lech Lecha to Abraham, and that we get to continue. And that reframed the present moment from this black hole I'm drowning in to looking at the moment and saying, this is yet another chapter in a very, very old story. And we get to choose how we live through this chapter and how we give it meaning and how we connect it to what came before us and how we force ourselves to look forward and think what we can do to bring a better future about.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. While the Jewish people, and all people of goodwill, continue to face deep uncertainty about what's happening in Israel and around the world, as I record this on Sunday afternoon, we're just beginning to process the end of Assad's rule in Syria and trying to figure out if it's a net positive or negative for democratic countries in general, and Israel in particular. We are all in some ways looking for sources of resilience. What are the ways that we can move forward and figure out our roles while trying to internalize a sense of hope and without ignoring the sometimes harsh reality that surrounds us? To learn more about potential sources of resilience, I was honored to speak to Rachel Sharansky Danziger. Hers was a very personal presentation, and I was truly moved by her deep faith in learning as well as her obvious wisdom. We talked about 3 key moments on October 7th and what they taught her about how to move forward, the manner in which Torah study and teaching Torah have been spiritual and emotional anchors for her and her students, the possibility of creating our own path to help expand God's presence in the world while simultaneously inviting God into partnership with us, the boldness of Chana and her prayer and the message she has for us today, learning how to accept that even good choices may have negative consequences, and trying to let go of the guilt that accompanies those choices, imagining what the world can still become, and much more. We'll get to that conversation in a moment. First, I'm honored to be hosting this Motzei Shabbat a live podcast panel conversation entitled Children Under the Radar, Strategies for Noticing and Maximizing Varied Strengths and Abilities. This is a panel conversation that aims to help parents, educators, and community leaders empower children whose talents can go unnoticed. The panel will consist of Rabbi Benjamin Krause, Dr. Rachel Yaish, and Howard Blass. It will take place this Motzei Shabbat, December 14th at 7:30 p.m. at Congregation Shomrei Torah in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. It's sponsored by Inspired by Ilona, and I am very honored to be part of this conversation, and I hope you'll join us. I will also be spending that entire Shabbat at Congregation Shomrei Torah in Fair Lawn. I'll be speaking 4 times over Shabbat. The first is a Friday night oneg entitled Do You Care Enough About Israel? A Community Conversation. The second is Shabbat morning, Who Was Yaakov's Real Wife? Prayer and Chesed as Antidotes to Fate. The third is Shabbat afternoon, the first chapter of Genesis, literal, allegorical, or a third option. And then at Sudash Lishit, How Did I Get to Where I Am Today? Rabbi Markowitz in conversation with Rabbi Kahn. If you'll be in Fair Lawn for Shabbat, I hope to see you there. Remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2024, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast. And JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rachel Sharansky Danziger is a Jerusalem-based writer and educator who lectures internationally about the intersections between Jewish texts, life in Israel, and the art of storytelling. Rachel earned her BA in philosophy and MA in American history at the Hebrew University. She is the co-editor of the recently published anthology of prayers, Az Nashir, We Will Sing Again, Women's Prayers for Our Time of Need, and is currently working on a book about family stories in the Book of Judges as a Sefaria Fellow. Rachel Sharansky Danziger, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you, Scott. It's an honor to be here.
Today we're going to speak about resilience, which is something that I know you, Rachel, have spoken about and thought about a lot, and which I believe I can say you in many ways embody. This is a very broad question, and perhaps you might say this is unfair, but I'll ask you in a general sense, can you talk about some of the sources of resilience that you have found in your own life in the past 14 months since October 7th?
Wow. Speak about a big question that requires a big answer. In order to answer that, I want to invite you to go back to Simchat Torah 23 with me. And I want to invite you into my own experience of it. And I'm doing that with a caveat that my own experience was relatively fine. I was not down south holding the door of the mamad. I was not dashing to my reserve duty because I didn't serve in the army. My husband made Aliyah older, so he didn't serve in the army, so I wasn't afraid for him. My experience was so mild in real life terms that it sounds almost ridiculous to put it forth. And yet I think that it's representative of what many, many of us felt at the time. I want to invite you into 3 moments of that very difficult morning that, in a sense, live on in my memory as foreshadowings, as moments that I kept coming back to and drawing strength from what they taught me. The first moment was a moment when I realized that something actually went wrong. And it wasn't actually when we heard the siren, because when we heard the siren, it was so out of the blue that I was absolutely convinced it's a mistake. And I even told my young kids who were still home with me, we were 1 foot out, ready to go to shul. And I told them, this must be a mistake. Somebody messed up, but let's go down to the bomb shelter at the basement of the building so that if it ever happens for real, you will know where to go. And then I opened the door and I saw my non-religious neighbors running down the stairs as if the hounds of hell are at their heels. And I said, okay, never mind, let's go. And that was the moment that I first realized that something actually went really, really wrong. I started running down the stairs with my children. Again, not knowing what's going on, but realizing that there's real and acute danger. And I realized that my neighbor, my downstairs neighbor, is bedridden. He's an elderly man and he's bedridden. And I had to make a split-second decision. And I just yelled after my kids, keep going, I'll join you. And I went to help the neighbor. They didn't hear me, as I discovered after helping to pull the bed of my neighbor to the middle of the room and closing the shutters and then going to join my children in the bomb shelter. I discovered them huddled and crying hysterically because they didn't know what happened to me. All they knew is that suddenly there's an alarm, a siren, a sound they don't know about, and their mother looks scared, and then she disappears. And a few weeks into the war, my then 6-year-old told me that that was the scariest part of the war for him. Of everything that happened, not knowing what happened to me in that first moment was the scariest. So I carried a lot of guilt for a while, but also a lot of conviction because I told my kids, this is what we do. When we're in danger, we stand up for each other. And I knew you'll be safe. I didn't need to protect you because I knew you'll make it to the bomb shelter. And I knew that our neighbor won't be if I don't help him. So that's the decision I had to make. Now, am I happy that I traumatized my 6-year-old? No, I'm not happy about that at all. And I still carry a fair amount of regret and guilt about that. But I don't regret going to help my neighbor. And that instinct. And by the way, I'm not sharing that in order to aggrandize myself. I think everybody was doing something, a variation on that choice at that moment. But that realization that our instinct is to stand up for each other, is to look out for the people around us. And the realization that everybody around me shares this instinct in that moment. And just like I went to check on my neighbor, other people went to check on another elderly neighbor, and other people took care of my kids because they saw that my kids are alone in the bomb shelter. And that was, of course, just a microcosmos of what was happening on a much larger scale down south. That's something I keep going back to as a source of resilience and strength, both in just the normal social sense that as long as we're in a society where people go out of their way to help each other, they will, as a society, we will survive, but also emotionally for myself. It reminds me that I'm not alone. It reminds me that I spent the rest of that Simchat Torah surrounded by my community, because I did take my kids to shul. And we all squished, all hundreds of us squished into a small bomb shelter and ran Simchat Torah services in that small bomb shelter. And we held hands and were together, and that carried me through. And throughout the war, every time that the world felt particularly bleak, I forced myself to look up and look around and both ask myself, who can I help right now? But also look at the helpers, look at other people helping me or even helping each other. You know, watching people doing good deeds, not even directed at me, gave me strength because it reminded me of who we are and what we are.
You know, Rachel, when you say look for the helpers, I'm forced to mention that the great Fred Rogers, I don't know if this is something you were saying consciously, but Mr. Rogers, I interviewed a friend of mine named Tim Madigan, who is the author of a book called I'm Proud of You, about his relationship with Mr. Rogers. And that's something which I know Mr. Rogers is famous for saying. I'm sure Tim has said this as well in his name. Look for the helpers is something that Mr. Rogers learned from his mother. When things are bleak, when things are difficult, that's what he says to do. Look for the helpers. That is what he calls his source of resilience. I didn't mean to interrupt. I simply had to mention that remez, that hint you made over there, because I think that's very important.
And I think it's really important because it resurrects our faith. And I don't mean faith in God right now. It means faith in ourselves, faith in humanity. And I think so much of what happened in the past year, but honestly also the year before that, the year of the protests and counter-protests, was that we lost faith in each other and in our joint future, shared enterprise as Israel, or as the Jewish people more broadly. And whenever I look up and I see people helping each other and standing up for each other, I see the possibility of a future, and I find strength in that.
I want to mention something else that you said, even though this wasn't your point, I think, but when you talk about, and I'm sorry to raise this, the guilt that you still feel about having to make that choice, do you help that bedridden neighbor, or do you let your kids go down with you and leave the neighbor alone? And you still feel bad about the choice you made, even though you would do it again, and it was in some ways, quote unquote, the right choice. To me, when I hear that, on the one hand, it might be a negative. There's no perfect choice. There's no choice that solves all the problems. Sometimes we think, what is the right answer? And I find in talking to people, the best advice sometimes is there is no perfect answer. So on the one hand, that can feel depressing, but that's not what I mean. I mean, in some ways, it can actually be empowering. All answers, reasonably decided, have an element of good in them, and there is no perfect answer, so you have to do what you feel is right in some of these situations, and you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
I agree, and I think it fits into a bigger issue, which is that I feel like this past 14 months really thrust us into a way of life or a state of being where everything we deal with is very real. We're dealing with life and death and loss and injuries and friends who are homeless all of a sudden, and children who are at war or spouses who are at war. We're dealing with things that are real in a way that is not how it kind of breaks our normal calibration. And when you deal with real things, there's never going to be a perfect choice. It's just, you're in a different arena. Your dilemmas are different. Your questions are different. For me, that moment, that making that choice, which honestly didn't feel like a choice, it felt like an instinctive decision that I then turned into a choice when I recast it in my mind, looking back with the leisure to consider options. At the time, it was not even a question to me. It's like, of course, I'm going to go and help, protect someone who can protect themselves at that moment and not worry about my children's possible trauma. It's not a question. But that was the moment when I realized I'm dealing with something real.
If I can comment on that one point before we move on to the other moments that you had, that's what I understand when we hear from our sages, that this world is called Alma de Shikra, the world of falsehood, as opposed to Olam Haba, which is Olam Ha'emet, the world of truth. At least as I understand that, it means in large part that there is no perfect choice. It means that everything here contains some element of imperfection within it. So I think that seeing what you call real is an aspect of the world in which we live, and that's called living in the real world as opposed to living in a pretend world, which will exist one day, but certainly does not exist yet.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, we just read Parshat Toldot in Shul, and we read about Jacob stealing the blessings. And it's such a contentious, controversial moment, and much ink and many words have been used to try and understand it over the generations. One of the things that I am struck with or struck by every year in this Parsha is that even if you think, as some commentators do, that Jacob was absolutely justified in what he did, he still pays the price. He still pays the price for the rest of his life, in a sense, because being torn away from his home, being estranged from his brother, leads him into Haran, leads him into all these complicated relationships with his wives and later with his children, and it just overshadows his entire life. And that's the way it is. In life, you make choices, and sometimes they're the right choices, but the cost doesn't go away. And again, I feel ridiculous even casting my little moment of choice in these big epic terms, because really it was nothing. No rocket hit Jerusalem at the end. Like, we were fine. And at the same time, mothers in Kfar Aza and in Be'eri were dealing with the real world on a much more stark scale. Yet, when I try and understand myself, when I try and understand how to find strength within myself in this war, all I can go to is my own experience at the end of the day. And that leads me to the second moment that was significant to me. And that was after the first round of sirens. The first round of sirens, we were all in the bomb shelter, some of us earlier than others. And then when there was a pause, I decided to go up, get ourselves together, and go to our shul. Our shul is 1.5 minutes from our house. I knew it's within the safe time distance in case there's another siren, but I didn't want to be separated from my husband and my older child. And also, I knew that in our shul, there are many army people who might tell me what we're supposed to be doing, because I was totally clueless. I had no idea what's going on. And as we walked up the stairs, I ran into an older neighbor who didn't leave her house. She just stood in the staircase during the sirens. And she's not a religious person. She was watching television all morning, and she was crying hysterically. You know, it's always very startling when you see an adult crying hysterically and yelling things that sounded like absolute science fiction to me. That the army can't get to wounded people, that there are a few people kidnapped into Gaza. It all sounded completely impossible, and yet, even if a sliver of it was true, it was the worst thing that ever happened in my lifetime. Now, of course, now we know that it was so much worse than that. But in that moment, I started crying hysterically myself into my hands, because how could I not? And suddenly, through my fingers, I saw my daughter, who was then 10 years old, looking at me, and her face was absolutely white, and her eyes were huge. And it just snapped me out of my own experience, and I realized that I can't afford to fall apart. Because while I can't fight the terrorists in the south or help the army get to the wounded people or do anything about the hostages being taken into Gaza, there is something I can and must do, and that is safeguard my children, both physically, make sure they follow the instructions and sirens, etc., but also mentally and psychologically, try and make this an experience of strength and resilience for them so they don't end up scarred by it too much. And this realization went very deep, and I kept coming back to it over and over again, because it really brought home what became to me really the lifeline throughout this 14 months, and something I shared as a teacher and a writer with others as well. And that is the need to focus on what's in my own hands. It's easy to drown when so many terrible things are happening all around you. And you do drown because there's nothing you can do about them. So you lose your sense of agency, you lose your sense of self, and all you're left with is crippling anxiety and horror. But that's not what we're here for in this world. We're here to do things, to create things, to find a path forward. And the only way for me to do it is by asking myself every day, what's in my hands today? Or every hour, what's in my hands this hour? And in that moment, I knew that what's in my hands is my children's serenity or long-term psychological health. Since then, the answer changed. But that question is something I keep holding on to.
I'm just thinking about the nature of your personal experience and the way that we can extend it and think about the way that that will be true for us. What you could do, what you can focus on, the thing that Rachel was able to do at that moment. There are things that we can't do. There are things we can't control. But what can I control? And that, I think, is a lesson that anyone can then apply to any aspect of life when things feel like they're getting out of control. So thank you for that. What was the third moment?
The third moment was actually a very painful moment. That was after I made it to shul, and after we danced a little bit and prayed some, and then sat and listened to the Baal Koreh read the first verses of Genesis. And I can't describe how tightly packed together we sat there, which at the moment suited our needs very well because we all needed to feel that we're with other people. I can't describe how loudly he had to read to speak the sirens that were going on and on and on outside. And I can't describe the almost surreal feeling when the Baal Koreh reads about the creation of the world and how everything is put in order and put beautifully together. Well, our overwhelming experience was that our world, as we know it, our orderly, beautiful world is being unmade from underneath our feet. But in that moment, something really struck me. And for me, I think that's the point I keep coming back to the most. And that is that, yes, our enemies forced on us something we didn't want. They forced on us a war we didn't choose to engage in. They forced on us a level of loss that was unimaginable within Israel before. Post-pogroms, post-Holocaust, who can talk about over 1,000 dead in one day? What is this reality? But they didn't take our ability to choose or to create our own path, because here we were setting on the journey through the Torah that we set on every single year, that we choose to commit ourselves to. And even if in that moment, the overwhelming experience was one of devastation and an unmaking and not of a creation, the fact we sat there and read the Torah and knew that the week after we'll read it again, and the week after we'll read it again, meant that we're not allowing ourselves to lose our ability to decide who we are and to give meaning to our experiences. And I'll say more than that. I recently read Rabbi Sachs' book, Will We Have Jewish Grandchildren? And in that book, he talks about a beautiful midrash that the sages devised after the destruction of the temple. And in this midrash, they talk about King David's death. And they say that King David knew that he was going to die on a Shabbat. And he also knew that as long as he learns Torah, the angel of death can't touch him. So every Shabbat, he would begin, as soon as Shabbat comes in, he would begin reciting and learning Torah, and he would go on for 24 hours and a bit until the end of Shabbat, and the angel of death couldn't touch him. In the end, the angel of death had to resort to trickery, to making some sound outside, and then making one of the stairs on the way to the garden collapse under King David's feet, so that for 1 second he would be startled out of his recitation and be vulnerable to death. But Rabbi Sachs suggests that it's not really about King David, it's about us as a people. And Rabbi Sachs says this is a message of comfort, of nechama, to the people of Israel, because they just lost so much in the destruction of the temple, not just the physical temple. They lost a whole way of life. They lost their sovereignty. They lost their sense of self. And this midrash reminds them that as long as they keep learning the Torah, they will survive. They will survive the war against death as a people, not as individuals. But as a people, they will survive. And I think that moment in Shul, hearing about Bereshit and the creation of the world, and marveling at the fact that here we are saying the words despite everything happening around us, was a moment of connecting to that sense of eternal life pulse of the Jewish people.
That's a beautiful idea, and I appreciate your sharing that thought of Rabbi Sachs. And Rachel, that actually does lead us into a parallel conversation that I'd like to talk about with you. The idea of limud haTorah, learning Torah and teaching Torah, writing about Torah, the ways that has been a source of resilience for you and by extension for many other people. I'd like to ask you on a personal level. You are a well-known teacher of Torah, a writer on Torah. Can you talk about the ways that Torah learning and teaching has been a source of resilience for you on a personal level, beyond the national level that we simply continue learning and reading the Torah every single week?
Yeah, and here I would want to separate between learning Torah and teaching Torah. Engaging with Torah in any capacity was a constant reminder, a very needed reminder, to look past the present moment. Meaning, I felt like the bad news and the losses and all the challenges faced by people close to me or far from me kept pushing me into a state of mind of drowning in the moment and seeing no way out and feeling like the walls are closing on me. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think many of us felt that in particularly dark days. Engaging with Torah reminded me that we're part of a bigger journey and a bigger story, one that started in Mount Sinai or even before that with Lech Lecha, with God's Lech Lecha to Abraham, and that we get to continue. And that refrained the present moment from this black hole I'm drowning in, and that we're just fighting for our lives and we're reactive to what reality forces on us, to looking at the moment and saying, this is yet another chapter in a very, very old story. And we get to choose how we live through this chapter and how we give it meaning and how we connect it to what came before us and how we force ourselves to look forward and think what we can do to bring a better future about. In a sense, to me, what encapsulates that role of Torah was Shir Ma'alot, actually.
Which Shir Ma'alot?
The one we sing every Shabbat before we bench. Because, and I taught it many times over this year, because in Shir Ma'alot, the psalmist is dealing with a sense of trauma. It's a happy trauma, which sounds odd, I know. It's a trauma of return, but it is a trauma because there's rupture. There was the world before the return, and there was a world after the return. And how do you fit it all together? How do you make sense of it? How do you understand who you are within this world? And furthermore, there's a return and you think it is a happy ending. And then you discover there's actually a great deal of difficulty and challenges still ahead. We know historically that's what happened in Shivat Zion, that people came upon Achrazat Koresh, right? Koresh called them to come back. They came back and then they discovered that one, they're poor. Two, there's other peoples here who did not want them back. Three, there was like all kinds of physical difficulties and challenges, and they had to keep agitating with Jews back in Babylon, or in Paras, with the authorities, with the local chieftains, etc., etc.
Sounds a lot like today.
Yes, and I think that in a sense that psalm captures a truth that is essential for us today, which is we are in a process of tkuma, of rising up as a people. You know, I grew up in Israel. We always talk about Shoah and Tkuma, the Holocaust and the rising up, and it was a little bit too schematic and we criticized it, but still, we are in that process. In my personal familial story, I see it very well. My parents had to fight to get out of the Soviet Union. My husband came from the United States, made the choice to come here at a young age. So many of my friends are Olim. Some are children of Olim, some are grandchildren of Olim, and we're all here together rising up. And then it's very painful to realize that it's not smooth sailing to, a better tomorrow. And in fact, there's a lot of challenges and difficulties in this process itself. And in the middle of that psalm, the tone shifts from rejoicing to prayer and asking for help, because suddenly the psalmist finds themselves facing the difficulties of reality. And then they do the most remarkable thing. And they translate this experience of pain and resolution, of exile and return, of different states of mind and different states of being that don't fit together and you don't know what to make of them. They translate them into a metaphor that every person at that era would have known intimately and had, muscle memory of, the metaphor of sowing and reaping. And it develops this metaphor first briefly and then extends it a little bit and talks about walking and sowing, walking and bringing in the sheaves. And that one metaphor does two things. First and foremost, it tells you there will be a happy time at the end. It restores a sense of hope. But secondly, and no less importantly, to my opinion, it transforms the difficult time from just something we have to endure until we get to the other end into a time when we're doing something extremely important, because this is the sowing season. And I kept coming back to that in the darkest moments and saying, okay, right now I feel like I'm drowning in that black hole of the present moment, but actually this is the sowing season. Whatever we do now, whatever good things, whatever help we offer each other, whatever ideas we develop, however we pull ourselves from despair and into hope over and over and over again, however we choose life at any given moment, will be the seed of our tomorrow. And we're not going to just get to the end of the war if we don't, sow these seeds, so to speak. And so for me, engaging with Torah was a constant reminder of the breadth and length of our journey, the fact that we're more than this present moment, and that this present moment is not just a challenge to be endured, but rather a calling, an opportunity to say Hineni and sow seeds of the future we want to see.
That is such a beautiful idea. I have to tell you, Rachel, I never really thought about in any serious way the fact that Shir Hamalo mentions twice that the planting involves crying. It's not that it just involves challenge. It actually involves sadness and mourning. The ending both times is you come back with laughter, you come back with song, but the process is inevitably a painful process. The process of Tkuma, of this rising up, of rebirth, is not one that is neutral, as you called it before, smooth sailing. It's one that inevitably involves that difficulty. If I can just add one idea that sometimes I think about, because that I'd never thought about, and that really is make me think a lot. Even the fact that it says at the beginning, when we arrived back in Israel, in Sion, we were like dreamers. And that has two different meanings to me. On the one hand, you could say it means that everything until now was a dream, and now we wake up and all the terrible 2,000 years of exile was like a dream, and now it all dissipated. But there's another way of looking at it, which is that we're currently in a dream where nothing makes sense. Dreams are a place where logic is transcended and where things that should work easily don't necessarily work easily. And I'm guessing tarte mashma that both of those are implied, given everything that you're saying now.
Yeah, Rashi and Radak actually hold these opposing opinions. I don't remember now who holds which, but whether the past, the difficult past, turns to be like a dream because reality is so wonderful and it fades away, what came before, or whether the present feels unreal. Either way, it's a symptom of trauma. It's a symptom of rupture because we need to be able to hold both. We need to be able to embrace our past and make space for it in our personal narrative and the present. And I feel like Shir Malot, through that metaphor of the sowing and the walking and sowing, it invites us to use metaphors and ideas that are familiar to us, or at least were familiar to us then. And honestly, after the year we had, are more familiar to more of us than ever before, after all the volunteering in fields people did. But also by emphasizing motion, the action and the motion of walking and sowing and walking and carrying the sheaves, it almost feels very modern. You know, a lot of modern therapy focuses on body work, on focusing on what you feel in your body. And it's almost inviting us to embody our past, our present, and look to the future in this way.
Yeah, that's an important idea. I like that very much. I'm going to think a lot about that. Let's talk about how teaching Torah, which you said is a little bit different, has served as a source of resilience for you.
So I should say that teaching Torah served me as a source of resilience in two ways. First and foremost, teaching Torah forced me to put myself together and show up. Because the first week or two after October 7th, life became very small, meaning we had to focus on very immediate things. In my case, my three wonderful children who were home with me in that time and who had a lot of anxiety and couldn't sleep at night. Not that I slept so great. So I had to somehow sleeplessly take care of them and, be there for them. And it felt very much like a turning inwards. Instead of going and helping Am Yisrael in some grand way, here I am turning inwards because this is what's in my hands right now. But the thing is that caring for your children, your household, your friends, still very much leaves you within your intimate reality, within your personal world. The first time I had to go teach a week later, I realized that I'm leaving that womb-like experience. I'm going to really go out there, meet people, some of whom I know, some of whom I don't know, and they're going to look up to me. Not because I'm someone great or important or famous. They're going to look up to me because of my position as a Torah teacher. Like by assuming the mantle of a Torah teacher, I'm putting myself front and center where people look at me. And that is an awesome, in the real sense of the word, awesome responsibility. Because especially in a moment like this, when everybody's depressed and everybody's going from funeral to funeral and everybody's in shock and the bodies are still being identified and people are still waiting for news of their loved ones and a whole country seemingly doesn't sleep at night wondering what is happening with Noah Argemani and Shiri Bibas and the other hostages. I can't let these people down. I can't go and stand before them and fall apart, much like I couldn't fall apart before, in front of my daughter. I couldn't fall apart before of my, co-learners, my students. I had to embody for them a message of hopefulness. And it was one of the hardest things I ever had to do, that first shiur in Matan after October 7th. Like putting on my clothes, putting on my hat, but also putting on courage, putting on a face of hope, putting on a face of belief, of faith, of conviction that we will get through this. And then going into battle, except the battle here, of course, is just the battle against my own depression, but where the people I'm trying to protect from this depression is not just myself, it's also my students, and going into Torah with them and finding resilience together in it. So it was almost as if teaching Torah grabbed me by the hair, shook me, pulled me up from despair, and said, now get going. You gotta live up to your ideals now. Now is a test.
I have a couple of questions I want to ask you about that experience, if it's okay. One of them is, how much of this is a result of your being a teacher, and how much of it is a result of your being a teacher of Torah? What I mean is this. Theoretically, if you were teaching literature in a university or teaching physics, you still have students in front of you who need help, who need idud, encouragement, and hope and faith. That has nothing to do with the topic they're teaching. That's simply because, as you said, you are their teacher and are therefore a figure of a type of authority, or maybe you're an example for them. But you're a Torah teacher, and I'm guessing that the fact that you're teaching Torah as opposed to physics or literature made that experience somewhat different. Could you explain that?
Yeah, first of all, I should say that talking to other friends, colleagues who teach different things, many of them experience something similar. So there is something common to just putting yourself out there and needing to show up for people in a certain way. And that's true for teachers of children, of adults, TV anchors. It's true for many people in many professions. Where I feel that the Torah bit made it particularly poignant to me is that as a Torah teacher, I don't teach something that is morally neutral, meaning I teach something that is an embodiment to me of how I believe we should live our life. And I don't actually mean the law right now. I mean the values, the ideas, the way of life Torah encourages us to grapple with and ultimately choose to covenant ourselves with. And especially in a Torah class with adults, a lot of the emphasis is on the grappling. It's not, here I am to preach to you how to live your life. That's not the kind of teaching I do. It's, let's grapple together with, let's say, the text of Cain and Hevel and understand ultimately what it demands of us. What's the call that we should say hineni to from within this text? And when that's what you're teaching, when that's what I'm teaching, the way I teach it, the hopefulness I bring into it, the courage to look up and say, we will get through this, is not just an expression of my value system or how I think we should face disaster. It's an embodiment or a representation of how I think Torah encourages us to face disaster. And then if I fail, it's a double betrayal, because it's not just a betrayal of my position as a teacher in a classroom with people who, by virtue of the fact that I'm the teacher, look to me, again, not up to me, but look to me as an example or look to me for something in that moment. So it's not just a betrayal of my responsibility to them. It's also a betrayal of my responsibility to Torah and what I think Torah is teaching us. Meaning I have to embody in my own conduct what I think Torah wants us to do right now or suggests that we should do in this moment. And I think that's where the Torah bit really makes it more poignant in a sense.
Oh, I completely agree with that. I'm sure that's how your students felt as well. I want to ask you about that and something else that you said in first describing that. You talked about forcing yourself to go out there and being able to put on that garment of belief, of faith, of hopefulness, of looking positively towards the future. I'm wondering how much of that is real and how much of it is, so to speak, fake it till you make it. Meaning, when you put on that garment, are you, if I can ask this, being true to yourself, or are you trying to be what you want to be? In other words, are you taking something internally and forcing yourself to live it, or are you trying to convince yourself in that process as well?
No, I think I'm being true to myself. And I think it's a very intuitive and insightful question you're asking, because I think it goes really into the heart of it for me. And I should emphasize that everything I'm saying now is what works for me. I'm not trying to represent all Torah teachers in Israel in this war. In fact, I want to say something about that later, about different styles and different ways of engagement with Torah in this time. But for me personally, if I give myself the time to sit with the difficulty and the challenge and the pain and ask, what does it require of me? It's evident to me that what it requires me is to look up and keep going and keep creating and looking for ways to sow seeds of something better ahead. It's not fake. It's not a costume as much as it's battle gear, because sometimes we need to remind ourselves of that, to go back into the pain and back into being present with all this difficulty, and then find in it that seed of hopefulness. And, it's funny for a Torah teacher, perhaps, to quote Nick Cave, but in the Red Hand Files, a beautiful collections of letters Nick Cave publishes in answer to questions from fans and readers. He, in one point, says that hopefulness is an adversarial emotion because we have to look at reality, and reality is messy and difficult and painful and often tragic or devastating even. And we have to say, well, no, we reject what reality is trying to make us feel, which is hopelessness, which is even worse in a sense, cynicism or apathy. No, I will choose to feel hopeful. I will choose to say no, to defy this pressure that comes at me from the outside. And I will push back and say, I am going to feel hopeful regardless. And this really speaks to me. My husband brought this letter to my attention, and it really struck me because I feel that it encapsulates so much of how I relate to life right now.
I think that's really important. By the way, I do want to mention that when you said before that this is your personal experience, I'm a proponent of Henri Nouwen's well-known dictum, that which is most personal is most universal. So I think that's extraordinarily helpful, because those aspects of our personal lives that we think only are our own challenges, in fact, while they are personal, nevertheless, are the seeds from which other people can grow by hearing about them. Let me ask you about that particular question, Rachel. How much do you think that a Torah teacher needs to bring personal experience and private faith into teaching? How much of it should be, as you say, grappling with the text? And how much, at least for you, is about talking about what it means to me based on what I feel right now, based on what my faith is, based on what my beliefs are?
That's a good question, and I think there's more than one correct answer to it. I want to first say that I had many conversations with fellow educators where we constantly realize how differently we relate, both to the relationship between our feelings and the classroom and the war and the classroom. For example, a dear friend of mine from the United States, Tammy Jacobovich, an amazing educator, told me early in the war that she tries to leave the war outside of the classroom, by and large, because she thinks that it's important to establish a space where we engage with, like I said, our chosen journey, what we believe in, and build the backbone of who we are that is removed from the trauma and immediacy of the war right now. I can't do that. It might be better, it might be worse, I don't know. My personal style is I can't do this. I come into the class as I am, and I bring who I am in. That said, I want to make it clear that when I teach Torah, I don't teach from a place of this is how I feel, this is what I like, this is what appeals to me. Rather, I use my experience as a conduit to relate to the people around me, in a sense, to see what are we sharing in this moment. And then from that, say, from our shared feelings, from our communal space of experiences and feelings, let's walk into the text and then see what the place we're in will reveal for us, but perhaps was oblique to us before. It's almost, I think of it as wearing, firefighters sometimes wear these headlamps, right? I feel like our personal experience are the headlamps we wear as we walk into Torah. And then we notice things in a certain way that we might not have noticed had we not worn this particular headlamp. Now, does that mean that what we notice is true? And no, it means that what we notice bears grappling with or bears researching further. And, I strongly believe that you can go astray if you take it too far. If you wear your headlamp of your communal or personal feelings and go into a text and say, oh, I noticed this, and now this is the truth in and of itself. No, because just like you bring yourself, as my friend Gila Fine says, just like you bring yourself fully into the text, you should let the text bring itself fully into the conversation. But that's a second step for me, always. And that's not related to the war. That's just the way I engage with Torah, always.
Last night I was learning Navi with my daughter who's studying for a Navi test. We were learning Shmuel Bet, and whatever the question that came up, and I said there are two different ways of looking at this. And in talking about it, she asked me afterwards, she said, well, which one do you think is right? There are two different Mefarshim who said two different Pshatim on a certain pasuk. And I said to her that she's 15. I said, to me, I actually like the idea that there's more than one way of looking at it. And I try to think of Torah in general, and this text in particular, as being deep enough and big enough that can hold both truths at the same time. And sometimes perhaps it's trying to tell us that one isn't right more than the other, because when something is simple and simplistic, I should say perhaps, then it's very easy to say this is true and this is false. Physics is simple. It's very difficult to understand it, but the ideas are simple. But when you have something that's very, very big, when you have something that's very, very big and has a lot of different pieces to it, and is supposed to apply to all people at all times, then to say one thing is correct and another thing is incorrect, that can sometimes be true. There are things that are incorrect. It doesn't mean that anything goes. But there are times we can say it's good when, as an aspect of lahagdil Torah or lahadira, to make Torah great and glorious, we say both are true. There are elements of both that are aspects of truth in here, and trying to limit it to one or the other is a narrowing down of what Torah is supposed to be.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. And I think the real challenge is to know when you go too far with that.
Right.
When you start using that logic to justify any possible rating under the sun.
That's the danger.
That's the danger. But I prefer to dwell in the dangerous zone than treat Torah as something atrophied and narrow. Because if it's atrophied and narrow, why are we doing this? If it's a sea, if it's a path, if it's a journey that invites us to engage with it and go into it and be co-creators with God and the world through it, then that's worthwhile. If it's just this narrow code that landed on our heads and now we better conform to and never changes, it feels wrong. It feels unappealing. And I think it doesn't fit the messages the Torah itself teaches us, where it shows us these complex characters and these complex dilemmas, like we mentioned, Yaakov stealing the blessing, but that's only one small example of many, where we see that the Torah does not push us to say, oh, this is right, this is wrong, but rather to say, how do you live as a decent person, engaged with Kedusha, not just decency, also Kedusha and godliness in a world that's complicated and messy.
I heard Rav Schechter say in a lecture that people sometimes mistakenly treat Torah like a very precious antique. Don't touch it. You might break it. He said that is not what Torah is supposed to be. That doesn't mean we can change it. As anyone who knows Rav Schechter, he's quite traditional and conservative in his outlook. You can't change it, but you can adapt it to what is needed, and you must adapt it. And Rav Soloveitchik said the same thing when he said that if he were writing the Ikarei Emunah, the principles of faith, he would have included a 14th, which is that the Torah applies to all people in all times and all places. And I've been reading Rav Rabinovich, that's all as well this week, saying much of the same. I think these are very, very important lessons that we need to have in moving forward.
I would say, I absolutely agree, first of all. And I would say more than that. I would say that exactly because of that, because it's so important to engage and understand and relearn and constantly outgrow our previous understanding. I mean, if we kind of, not only should then the Torah be this atrophied, narrow thing that we are afraid to touch, but our understanding of it should keep growing as we adopt more and more headlamps, so to speak, interpretational headlamps. As we grow and become wiser and more experienced and have more perspective on the world, our perception of the Torah should change. If it doesn't change, then something is wrong with us, not as Torah learning, but as human beings, I think. But I mean, maybe it's harsh, but that's how I feel personally. It also underscores the importance of communal learning, of learning not just on your own, but rather in Chavruta or in the Beit Midrash or in a classroom or through reading other people's work and then writing your own. Because just like I today have different interpretational headlamps than I did a year ago, definitely than I did 2 years ago, so do you and other people around me have different headlamps than me? And if I only learn on my own, if I become solipsistic in my Torah learning and just focus on my feelings and what I see in the Torah and what I like about it, etc., I miss out on so much truth, on so much depth that you can offer me, that my students can offer me, my teachers can offer me. And I want to, with your permission, I want to bring one example of that.
Please do, yes.
One text that I liked before, but I keep coming back to since the beginning of the war, is the very beginning of Sefer Shmuel, the story of Chana going to pray for a son. For me, this is a foundational story in many, many ways. Forget the war. It's just a foundational story of who we are as a people, as a nation, because it captures the idea, the belief that we're not supposed to just accept reality as it is. That our role as human beings is to look at reality and say it can be improved upon, and then turn to God and invite him. And that's very chutzpahdik, but it's true. That's what she does. Invite him into partnership. Now, this idea for me is rooted way before that in Bereshit Bet, in the second story of creation, when the text starts telling us again how the world was created, and it says that their plants didn't grow yet because God didn't bring down rain, and there was no man to till the soil. And Rashi there, and to me, the most remarkable piece of commentary on all of Tanakh, says, maybe the point is not that there was no man to till the soil, but rather there was no man to recognize betovatam shel kshamim, the benefit that rain could bring to the world, how good it could be for the world to have rains, and then pray over it. In other words, according to Rashi, our first and foremost role, and not as Jews, as humans in the world, is to recognize what the world still can become, what the potential that's not actualized, recognize what can help, and then pursue it, but in partnership with God, connecting heaven and earth, so to speak. And I take that realization into Shmuel with me, and I see that Chana is doing exactly that. She looks at the world, she says, if I have a child, he can do good in the world. It's not just that I want a child, it's I will give this child to God. I will make him a servant of God, of adding kedusha, adding light to the world. So God, let's partner. And to me, the way I read it always, but also especially after this war started and after there were so many bad things and so many opportunities to improve the world, so to speak, that became apparent to us, to me, the overall feeling or the overall theme that runs through Chana's actions is boldness. Because to me, what Chana does is reject the world as God made it. She says, you made my womb, but the way you made it actually could be improved upon. You made a world where I can't bring children into the world. I am coming to you and I'm telling you, please join me, please partner with me. We together can bring something even better into actuality. And that's a very bold stance to take. Now, this was particularly on my mind since Pesach, when in partnership with two very, very dear friends, Shira Lankinshaps and Gordon, we started putting together a collection, an anthology of prayers written by women for women and anyone who's not put off by reading things in the female gender form for this time. And it was an idea Shira came up with on Shvi Shel Pesach, shared it with me and Anne, and we jumped on the opportunity to bring it into the world. We asked 55 women, including ourselves, so I guess 52 women, to write prayers. We put it together and we published right before Rosh Hashanah. And I kept thinking about Chana as we were working about it and about prayer as an act of boldness. And towards the end of the project, or what I thought was the end of the project, because at the time I didn't realize how much work remains when the content is complete, we sat down to write the introduction together. And I started writing the part where we anchoring our project, not only in the history of prayer over the generation and women's prayer, but also in Torah. And I wrote Chana as this bold, almost a convention-shattering character who shows us the way how we can approach God boldly and demand a better world from him. And Shira looked and said, but that's not what it means at all. It's not about boldness, it's about faith and vulnerability, because what Chana does is she comes to God and she tells him, I am vulnerable, I'm in pain, and I believe that you, the Almighty God, care about when I am in pain, little me. So it's really a surrender of her pain to God. And we kind of looked at each other, and there was this moment of, oh, our interpretational headlamps looking at us are totally different. I'm interested in choice and boldness. She's interested in vulnerability and honesty about pain. And the funny thing is that after this conversation, we each found ourselves taking more and more of the other's perspective as we go back to this text, as we understand our project, as we understand this time. And that's the beauty of learning Torah with other people, even in this kind of tangential way, that we grow.
I have to say that you, Rachel, have been using the term boldness, but you also use the word chutzpah. And frankly, to me, I happen to like that. The idea that prayer is an act of chutzpah. And indeed, Chazal and Masechet Brachot say in discussing Chana's prayer that, first of all, what we learn about prayer, we learn from Chana. It says she is like the embodiment or the example, the perfect prayer, so to speak. And there are two things about it. Chazal also say she was chutzpahdik towards Hashem. They say that she threw things towards heaven. And second of all, the establishment, embodied or represented by Eli Cohen, thought that she was wrong, and they didn't like the way that she was davening. He was criticizing her for something that she wasn't necessarily doing, but he thought her prayer was inappropriate, even though it turned into the prayer that became the template for the future Amidah. That's how we get it. We get it from Chana itself. And I think that's really, really interesting. The idea that prayer itself is an act of chutzpah, that God, the world is not the way that I want it to be. And I want it to be different. We're not just saying, Hashem, please give me a different world. We're saying, you're doing something, if I can say this chutzpahdik, that is not right. It's time to change things.
I absolutely agree. And I would put it a little different. I wouldn't say you're doing something that's not right, even though I have to tell you on a personal level, and that I'm not saying as a Torah teacher, I'm saying as a practicing, believing Jew, this year made it difficult not to feel this way sometimes towards God, especially when people I love fell in battle. But I would say that what you're doing, God, is limited. Let's expand it together. Now, it doesn't mean that it's limited by mistake. I think God limited the world in order to enable us to be his partners in this work.
It was a plan.
Exactly. But it's up to us to step up to plate. Is that the correct expression? I'm not an American.
Yes. Well said.
Plate and demand that partnership from him. And I think it's very interesting that God made that room for us. Because if God would have forced us into this position, if God had said, you need to be my partners, it wouldn't be true partnership. It would be indentured slavery, in a sense. By making space for us to see that things are not as good as they can be, and saying, let's extend your world together into a fuller, better, wiser, softer world, we are living up to our human potential. And to our Jewish potential as people who are engaged with Torah and engaged with God. And Torah, the stories of the Torah constantly, I feel, push us towards that, because there's always this sense of God waits for us to demand. God waits for us to step up before the change comes.
What you're saying reminds me of a book I've mentioned before, a classic play written by Elie Wiesel, The Trial of God, where it's based on a real event that apparently Elie Wiesel himself witnessed, which is that a group at Beit Din, 3 rabbis, got together to put God on trial during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, saying what you're doing is unfair for the people of Israel. In the story, as I understand what happened in real life, they essentially declared at the end the verdict, saying God is guilty of abandoning his people and not doing what he promised to do. And after they declared that verdict, they closed the books and daven Mariv, which is itself a very interesting way of understanding it. In the play that Elie Wiesel wrote, which he made take place several hundred years earlier for narrative reasons, in that play, the defender, the person who defends God, is a person named Sam. And the people who are saying God is doing something wrong argue that this is not okay. And yet Sam keeps on saying, no, how could you say that God did something that's incorrect? How could you dare say that? And the twist at the end is that Sam is short for Samael, which means the devil. Essentially, the one defending God by saying the world is perfect the way it is, it doesn't need any more. That is a satanic way of looking at the world.
This sounds to me almost like a direct engagement with the book of Job, where the 3 friends keep trying to make sense of the world and make it that Job is not okay because God and the world must be okay. God must be pristine and perfect. The world must be orderly and perfect. And from coming and just consoling or condoling with Job in the beginning, they very quickly become God's representatives, like you said, and God rejects that. God doesn't actually give an explanation at the end, or not an explanation that I understand at any rate, but God very clearly tells the friends, you're wrong. This is not your job. Your job is not to defend me. And I think God is God, and he doesn't need us to defend him. He needs us to demand partnership from him. Or need is too strong of a word. He invites us to demand partnership with him.
Rachel, I have to say, I got to about a third of my questions today, so I'm going to ask if at some point you can come back and speak to me again, because this is very, very enlightening. I really enjoyed this. And I felt very moved by a lot of what you said today. And just as a concluding question, let me ask you, we're talking about resilience, we're talking about partnership with God. If you had a message for listeners right now who are struggling, whether they're in Israel, whether they're outside of Israel, struggling with the darkness, the hester panim, the feeling that God isn't present in the way that they would like him to be present, and partnering with him might be a difficulty because I don't feel his presence. Could you give some recommendation? How would you answer them if they came to you and said, what do I do?
That's the biggest question, isn't it? Look, in a class context, I sit with people and I look at them eye to eye, and I know I can calculate better how my words will land because I'm with them in the room. It's a little scary to answer this question when I know that many different people will hear my answer, some of whom will find it helpful and some of whom would find it offensive or painful. So I apologize in advance if my words land harshly or painfully to you, dear listeners. That is not my intention. With that caveat, I think I would say two things. I would say, first and foremost, that we are finite beings, and as such, our perspective is limited. And I'm not saying that to imply that, and therefore God is right and we are wrong, and saying what's happening to us is unfair or wrong. That's not my point. My point is that we can't do anything in this world other than live in our own bodies and in our own perspectives. And our choice isn't to explain God's decisions or reject them. Our choice is, what do we do with our lives? What do we choose to focus on? Do we focus on the despair, or do we focus on reasons for hopefulness? Do we focus on how bad things are, or do we focus on the helpers, like we said in the beginning? Do we focus on the darkness, or do we focus on the light? And at the end of the day, that's the choice that makes us who we are. And it's not even a Jewish concept. I think that's a human concept. You don't need to be a Jew to sense intuitively that you are what you choose to make of the reality around you, in a sense. And in my harshest moment of pain in this war, when people very dear and close to me fell in battle, that was what I focused on. I couldn't deal with God's presence or God's decisions. I have no sense of what his intentions are. But I said, let's retreat to the place that is in my hands, like I said in the beginning. And that is what I choose to focus on. And sometimes it's very small. It's just to look for one good things to be grateful for today, or one thing that I can do for someone else. Sometimes it's much bigger than that. Sometimes it's going into a classroom and teaching Torah. Sometimes it's going to reserve duty. So it's all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, the drama of reality happens within us, not out there. And it may sound a little odd and solipsistic, but that's how I feel. So that's first. The second thing I want to say relates to this time in the year. We're now in Chodesh Kislev, a Chodesh that is the darkest time of the year, but also the time when we will celebrate Chanukah. And I never really understood Chanukah until last year. Last year during Chanukah, so many soldiers fell in battle. It was unbelievable. It was so painful. It was so dark. Every morning at 6 a.m., the release for publication notices appeared in the newspaper. It was in the internet. It was back when they only did it once a day. And I just felt like we're crushed to a powder under reality. And every night we had to go and make the choice to bring more light into the world. And furthermore, to place that light, the light of our candles, light of Hanukkah, the light of Pirsuma Nisa, of retelling the story of a miracle that happened to us, we had to place it in the doorway or in the window, in places where other people can see. And it felt like an antithesis to what we were feeling. To me, at least personally, I felt like all I want to do is curl in the darkness and cry, or escape into sleep and senselessness. And instead, I had to put myself together, light a light, and put it where others can see, which in a sense is a reenactment of that going out to teach feeling. But I feel like this Chag, this holiday, teaches us something about what to do when everything is really, really dark. And that is to accept that lighting a light has a weight to it. It's a burden. It's not easy and fun, not always. But that by accepting this burden on ourselves, we are changing the world. we are making the world less dark. And I would say another layer, I would add another layer to that and say that the reality we're living through, and here I don't mean just the war, I mean also the world response to the war, really pushes us to curl inwards, to just talk to our fellow Jews, to people who agree with us, and stop engaging with the world out there because they hate us. They don't want to hear what we have to say anyway. They'll never hear us. And I feel like Hanukkah forces us to reconsider that position of isolation because Hanukkah is a holiday that's all about pirsum, about putting something out there. And it's a holiday that pushes us to say, not only do we have to find it within ourselves to light a light when it's dark and all we want to do is curl into a ball and cry, but it also invites us to then take this light, this hard-won, weighty light, and put it in a vulnerable place, in a place where other people can see it. And here you see Shira Lankin-Shep's influence on me, right? About vulnerability. Put it out there and allow ourselves to be vulnerable because maybe, just maybe, it'll pay off. Just maybe the world, not just our internal world, but the world as a whole, will benefit from what we learned, what we experienced, what we acquired through our experiences. And maybe, just maybe, we can be a light unto the nations in our own small ways, in our private and national collective ways. So I don't know if that sounds too grand or too metaphorical, but sometimes the way to get out of depression is not slowly and step by step, but rather by jumping straight into something big and grand. And I feel like that's what Hanukkah is. Hanukkah says, shake yourself up, get up, find something that is miraculous in your eyes, even in the darkness, and boldly tell its story, because in doing that, you add light into the world. And maybe by adding light facing outwards, we can also heal ourselves even when it feels impossible.
Thank you for that beautiful, beautiful idea to conclude. I will just add one final point to that idea of going outward, that Pirsumei Nisa, demonstrating the miracle to people outside and the ability to be a light to the nations, which is our divinely ordained role. I have found that there are people outside the Jewish community who've been sources of strength for me, and I know many other people who felt the same way. Yes, there are people out there that are, we'll call them the haters. There are people out there who have no use for Jews and who are just viscerally against Israel and the Jewish people. But I found that by trying to the degree that any of us can, be a light to the outside, not only do we find the light inside, sometimes they can shine a light back on us. And their support from some of those people outside has been a source of strength for me personally. And that idea, have that mutual, maybe like a mirror, sending light outside and then they send light back to us, has been strengthening to me too. So I found that too.
I absolutely agree. I have to tell you on a small level, we have relatives through marriage who are not Jewish in the United States. And from early on in the war, they started giving me a few $100s a month to distribute to people in need here in Israel, to families impacted by the war, families of reservists, people who experience loss, etc. And every month, as I deal with this money, as I ask around, as I pass the money, as I find people who need it, because the one condition, the one request they made is that I don't give it to organizations, but rather to people I know or people I can vouch for. Every month as I do this, I am bolstered and I feel my hope being reborn because I see they care. It's a reminder that they care. And I would like to read one short prayer that I wrote for our book.
Is this in Aznashir, the book?
Yeah, from Aznashir. One short prayer that I wrote towards the end, after Shira and Anne and myself have worked and with all the different authors and collected the prayers and edited them and translated them with the help of our team of translators who are amazing, by the way, and did like all this intense work. And then came time to write our own prayers. And I thought about this feeling every month of receiving a monetary, physical reminder that there are people out there who don't buy the lies and care for us. And from that feeling, I wrote the prayer. I wrote it in Hebrew, but I'll read it in English for you. Moda ani, my God, my living and enduring King, I thank you for the people who strengthen my soul, the people who help each other and support each other at this difficult time, from close and from afar and with great mercy, and restore my faith in the future and in humanity and in you. Because at the end of the day, even when I can't account for God's decisions, I can find strength in other people. And that opens up a place to renegotiate terms with God, even at the darkest of time.
Rachel, this has been deeply moving for me, and I owe a special hakarat tov to Dr. Erica Brown, our mutual friend, who put us in touch with each other and said, I think you guys should do a podcast together. She was absolutely right, and I want to thank you. This was a really, really important conversation for me, and I'm sure for everyone listening. Rachel Sharansky Danziger, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.